Good evening and welcome to HM Online, what feels like the midpoint now of an 11-day festival of programs by which we seek to give an alternative stimulation to those who would normally attend Historical Materialism London, one of the biggest Marxist academic conferences in the world, and also reach out both to old HMers who regularly attend our conferences across the globe and to new people. This session is on real abstraction. Its title is Whither, Real Abstraction, and I'm very pleased to introduce three stellar names in the field. First of all, Dr. Katerina Kolozova is senior researcher and full professor at the Institute of Social Sciences and Humanities at Skopje. She is also a professor of philosophy of law at the doctoral school at the University American College. Her most recent monograph, which most of you I'm sure would have read, is Capitalism's Holocaust of Animals, a non-Marxist critique of capital, philosophy and patriarchy. That's published by Bloomsbury. And probably her best known work is Cut of the Real, Subjectivity in Post-Structuralist Philosophy, published by Columbia. Now, she's going to go first, and her paper will be The Radical Dyad of the Non-Human, Thinking Inequality Beyond Identity as Reification. Then we have Articulations, Real Abstraction and Racial Capitalism. That's going to be a paper by Alberto Toscano, who is reader in critical theory in the Department of Sociology and co-director of the Centre for Philosophy and Critical Theory at Goldsmiths in the University of London, and is currently visiting faculty at the School of Communications at Simon Fraser in Canada. His books include The Theatre of Production, Fanaticism on the Uses of an Idea, and Cartographies of the Absolute. But many people know his work also through his translating of Antonio Negri, Alain Badiou, Franco Fortini, and others. Alberto, of course, is also one of the editorial board of Historical Materialism. And bringing up the rear, so to speak, is Conrad Hamilton on The Unfinished Revolution of Real Abstraction. Conrad's a doctoral student at Paris 8 University, currently developing and actually finishing a thesis on the relationship between the value, form, and social agency in the work of Karl Marx. He's co-author with Matthew McManus of What is Postmodern Conservatism, and also co-author of Myth and Mayhem, a leftist critique of Jordan Peterson, and doesn't he deserve it? Those three papers will be about 15 to 20 minutes each, and then there'll be an awful lot of time for questions and discussion on what I think is an issue which, of course, is theoretically interesting and sophisticated in itself, but also very important in also thinking about political strategy and activism. So over to you, Katerina. Katerina, I think you're muted.
Can you hear me all right? Can you hear me now?
Yes, now. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Paul, and thank you for the invitation to this panel. I'll start reading basically my concept for what is to become a paper, and I'll start with it immediately because I think that it's slightly above 15 minutes if I need to read it with a normal pace. So I'm beginning now, and also, yeah, thank you for the occasion to explain to the audience of this conference and to the readers of Historical Materialism that the notion of non-Marxism is not anti-Marxism, it is not a negation of Marxism, quite to the contrary, non-Marxism purports to be radical Marxism. So in case there is any confusion around the term. Okay, let me start now with this paragraph. Okay. Sohn-Rethel's epistemology relies on one simple premise. A materialist methodology science and the science of the species being of humanity, including political economy, must have a materialist account of the abstractions that constitute human lives. Social relations, economy, are abstractions that have a real or material effect on human realities, as well as on other forms of living and non-living physical reality. Now, I choose to refer to forms of physical reality instead of material realities or materialities, due to the fact that nature, at least according to the non-philosophical reading of the notion, or the non-standard philosophical reading of the notion, as per Laruelle, nature is a notion also heavily indebted to philosophy and theology through that as a form of philosophy. Also, the intention is to avoid, I would avoid the use of material, or I have avoided at the beginning. I will inevitably resort to it later on. There is no choice. So I also avoid the use of material for the same reasons Marx avoided it, and instead resorted to the terms real and physical, sometimes sensuous too, namely to circumvent the possibility of being mistakenly assumed to espouse the spontaneous use of philosophical materialism. For example, that of the young Hegelians and Feuerbach, whom Marx criticized, as we know. The core of this critique was that Feuerbach remained entrapped in a form of idealism because his materialism is subjected to the same legislating principles that found and govern philosophy, all philosophy, its apex being Hegel. In other words, philosophy cannot escape the form of idealism. And that is why philosophical materialism is merely different semantics filling up the same structure, that of idealism. In order to overcome this problem and move away from philosophy towards science, Marx argues an Ausgang, exit from philosophy, is required. Marx's own work, the execution of his project in the Capital and Grundrisse, for example, is a demonstration of how one departs from philosophical abstractions. Now, this is a different sort of abstractions than those discussed and promulgated by Sohn-Rethel as part of his Marxist epistemology. So these abstractions that Marx problematizes are in fact generalizations, philosophically spontaneous abstractions, to use Laruellian parlance, cumulative imaginary projections combining science, philosophy, common sense, and mythology of the quotidian in a vague assemblage of a manifest image of reality. So these abstractions, these scientifically unexamined abstractions, are something to move away from, says Marx, in order to arrive at the concreteness that constitutes them. And only after that, extract a new form of abstractions that is scientifically construed, extrapolated, right, let's say. So this permits an extraction of abstractions in the methodological, not ontological sense. Extrapolations of formalized and formalizable notions from the examined material reality. The prerequisite for such a posture of thought and an ensuing process of scientific operation that nonetheless departs from philosophy is to shift the position of the philosophical gaze. to carry out an non-Euclidean shift and thus do away with a subjectivity-centered thought. Sorry for this sound of notifications. Muted. So to do away with subjectivity-centered thought, which Marx identifies in particular in his critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, but elsewhere too, his writings on Feuerbach, German ideology, etc. So subjectivity-centered thought is identified by Marx as the main culprit for philosophy's self-centeredness, its autoreferentiality, and inability to produce accounts of the real. It is we can also use material once we are aware that we are moving away from the philosophical concept of the material, or the one that is endowed with the or grounded in the principle of philosophical sufficiency as problematized by Laruelle, myself, and others. Okay, so accounts of the real. It is not an error to liken this barred real with the Lacanian real, if that helps get the point across more easily. So this universal subject, megalomanically expanded by Hegel to the universal principle defining all possible reality, morphed into the spirit that cuts across history and ultimately manifests itself realized or materialized through the negation of its materiality, is a mere projection of the human ideal, argues Marx explicitly. So the human ideal or the ideal of Enlightenment humanism taken to its infantile extremes, bordering with the grotesque. The solution Marx proposes is methodological, even though it implies a certain metaphysical shift too, assuming, and this is the solution he proposes, to assume a third party's position that sees human subjectivity and thus humanity as object among objects. This would be a post-humanist proposal par excellence, but one preceding post-structuralism. So, building on Marx's proposal to exit philosophy's self-circumscription by rejecting the idea of fully doing away with philosophy as untenable, François Laruelle proposes a science of philosophy and the science operating with the conceptual repository of philosophy that would transcend a single axiomatic problem, that of the principle of philosophical sufficiency. And now we'll explain what that is. The principle of philosophical sufficiency refers to and is grounded in the procedure of what Laruelle calls the procedure of philosophical amphibology, whereby thought and the real are equated in the form of a philosophical truth. So not scientific truth, philosophical truth. Here is how this truth looks like. Being, for example, to on in Greek philosophy, is the principle in the temporal and axiological sense of the word. Being is the principal product of said amphibology. Thought and real constitute a single form of reality, transcendence, a truth, therefore, posturing as immanence, so transcendence posturing as immanence, whereby the real and the thought that relates and mediates the real, are unified into an entity, to on, that is presumed to be the true real. And here lies the problem: the true real, truth and the real unified. Thus, not merely real, but real endowed with truth. This dream of reality imbued with truth, with spirit, and that spirit has can be but human spirit. There is no other way around it. So this reality imbued with truth, with human spirit, elevated or sublimated reality, whereby the real becomes more real than the real itself, because human knowledge and the real have collapsed into a perfect unity. This unity is what Laruelle's identification in the last instance, so not reduction, identification in the last instance of all philosophy to the act of philosophical decision is all about. Therefore, to criticize philosophical decisionism in Laruellian terms is not to claim that philosophy or science should not postulate about the real, but rather not to decide what it is in and of itself, and instead admit its radical foreclosure. But unlike what the post-structuralists or postmodernists do, once this foreclosure is admitted, thought seeks to mediate it, explicate it, convey truth, and therefore control of it, without seeking to merge with it, institute a union of thought and the real. Such impulse would be purely philosophical, whereas the scientific posture of thought is completely different, I would say opposite to, or has an opposite impulse. To assume this posture of thought means, according to Laruelle, to assume a position vis-a-vis human cognitive activity, which is thought, and reality as exteriority, that is by its constitution equal to that of scientific thought. In this way, one might remain within philosophy. So this is what non-philosophy is all about. And this is, and in a very similar way, actually, analogous or in fact, by way of inference, the same method is applied on Marxism as well. That is on the treatment of the philosophical tenets in Marxism, hence the term non-Marxism. So in this way, one might remain within philosophy, continue operating with philosophical material while staying outside of it, miming the scientific posture and ambition of thought. Therefore, the relation between the two, the real and thought, is unilateral. The real remains indifferent to thought's ambition, whereas the latter continues to clone, as Laruelle would put it, or to produce Maßstab, as Wittgenstein would put it, of the real. So regardless of the indifference of the real. Because the pretension that a philosophical unity of truth and the real is something we have moved away from. Thereby, the radical dyad of thought and the real is constituted. So this is the radical dyad. never amounting to a unity of the two elements, in this case, thought and the real. Never amounting to a unity of the two elements, to a reconciliation of a duality, to acquiescence of the attention, but quite to the contrary, affirming it. The dyad is therefore radical because it always remains a dyad. It is not a duality or dualism that seeks to overcome either through some synthesis or reconciliation, which would be the vulgar dialectics, or a playful affirmation of a paradox, which would be the postmodernist move. Also, it is not an ontology. It does not speak the truth of how things are with regard to what is and what is not the real. It does not legislate the real, already affirmed as foreclosed. It is a method. The non in non-philosophy and non-Marxism does not stand for anti, but quite the opposite, a radicalization of the conceptual core in the both by way of reading the doctrines of their philosophical legacy structured in line with the principle of philosophical sufficiency. So applying all of this on the notion of the human, which we would term here in line with a non-standard philosophy as the non-human, so human without the principle of philosophical sufficiency. So applying all of this logic to a contemplation of what the human subjectivity might be, we'll propose the following argument. Doing away with, and it follows from the entire episteme I've been presenting thus far. So doing away with anthropocentrism as the foundation of all philosophy leads us to the notion of the non-human rather than the post-human, which in line with the episteme of non-philosophy would mean radical humanism rid of philosophical concept of the human, placed beyond any form of anthropocentrism, so beyond any form of anthropocentrism and human-centered thought, and thus an object among objects. So at the level of subjectivity, we can apply the same method and recognize the prelingual real at the heart of the non-human or the human on the one hand, and this, you can consider this real, this prelingual real in Lacanian terms, for example, and it wouldn't be wrong. I mean, it wouldn't go against the logic of non-philosophy. So we can apply the same method and recognize the prelingual real on at the heart of the human that we call the non-human on the one hand, and the signifying automaton, the languages, and its effect, the subject, which is there, on the other hand. So the real of the human in human, as Laurel would put it, is indifferent to the processes of signification, just as the real of some exteriority is indifferent vis-a-vis the unilateral tendency of thought to signify it, relate, mediate it, create knowledge or truth of it. So this originary alienation is never to be overcome by the non-human, conceived as a radical dyad. A dyad of a foreclosed real and the signifying automaton and its effect, the subject. It is a real abstraction that yields material effects, an abstraction that yields effects of the real, an instance of transcendence and a material reality of cognition that is real and allows for a materialist account in and of itself. Finally, this is a purely formal category. Just as labor, in strictly Marxian sense, just as labor or social relations that are these real abstractions, according to Sohn-Rethel. So this radical dyad, the non-human is also a real abstraction. But these categories these categories are, as I said, purely formal. So to reduce any of them, including the radical dyad of the non-human, to some semantic content, that would be, and a content that would entail a certain identification with okay, never mind, let's not go into that because it's going to be long, but that semantic content might entail identity as well. So to reduce this purely formal category to semantic content, such gesture in Marxist terms would be an error of reification and an analogy of a capitalist commodity fetishization. So how do we think oppression then? Beyond the logic of identity politics, beyond a thought that would be subjectivity centered. Thinking oppression from the third party perspective, the one that Marx proposed originally as the only way of moving away from philosophy as self-sufficient, auto-referential, etc. So thinking oppression from the third party perspective, a method developed by Marx, abandoning human-centered thought, which remains such even when it is termed post-transhumanist or even anti-humanist, it still remains humanist, but is surpassed through the notion of the non-human, doing away with subjectivity-centered thought as proposed by both Marx and Laruelle would enable a radical structural critique of an endless sequence of intersecting forms of inequality beyond subjectivity-centered thought, one that inevitably engenders the dogma of identity politics, even when trying to be anti-dogmatic, such as in the case of postmodernism and post-structuralism. So I hope I haven't passed my limit.
Okay, thanks very much, Katerina. Really interesting discussion. And I think particularly the relationship between Marx and Laruelle is always controversial and always worth exploring. I now hand over to Alberto Toscano.
Okay, thank you very much, Paul. And obviously thanks also to Katerina and Conrad for working together on this panel. So what I want to do in this brief talk is really to continue to explore the connection between Marxist critiques of real abstraction and contemporary debates on the nexus of race and capital. Some of this work I sketched out with Brenna Bandar in a piece called Race, Real Estate, and Real Abstraction a few years ago. And I wanted to explore here some dimensions of this connection between real abstraction and racial capitalism that weren't as foregrounded in that, in that earlier piece. And I suppose my first point would be to try to think briefly about a tendency, I suppose a tendency that has been common, not just in Marxist or Marxian debates, to treat capital as the abstract universal pole in this, in any analysis of the relationship between capitalism and race. So in some sense, and this, again, can be put forward by kind of class first traditional Marxists, but it can also be the presupposition of critics of Marxism who see it as inevitably and invariably diminishing or displacing the claims of particularity, right? So we would have, on the one hand, this abstract universal logic of capital, and on the other hand, the particularities of race that would then be added to or articulated with other forms of particularities of oppression and identity and so on. Now, I think any way of advancing both the discussion, at least in its more political aspects of real abstraction, and discussions of racial capitalism should really entirely abandon what I think is a wholly fallacious polarity. One of the formulations of this, in an argument that does not lack nuance, formulations of this idea that capitalism is on the side of the abstract and race alongside with gender, sexuality, etc., is on the side of particularity, we can find in a Deutscher lecture by Ellen Wood from 1988, which has been already the object of much critical discussion, Capitalism and Human Emancipation. I suppose it's been the object of much discussion also because she puts the point with customary clarity. She says the first point about capitalism is that it is uniquely indifferent to the social identities of the people it exploits. Unlike previous modes of production, capitalist exploitation is not inextricably linked with extra-economic, juridical, or political identities, inequalities, or differences. In fact, and I think this is, in a sense, the nub of my criticism in a way, in fact, she says, there is a positive tendency in capitalism to undermine such differences and even to dilute identities like gender or race, as capital strives to absorb people into the labor market, so on and so forth. Now, whilst Wood does recognize that capitalism in its concrete deployment works through extra economic forms of oppression, she talks about this in terms of co-opting, in a sense you could say almost formally subsuming, forms of oppression, racial and gender oppression that exists in a sense outside of it. Unlike class, which is of course imminent to this form of abstract domination. Now, I think that here we can speak, and Wood is by no means the only culprit in this position. In fact, obviously there's many passages in Marx himself that one could turn to potentially as well. But we could speak here of what I like to call somewhat in a kind of détournement of Whitehead, a fallacy of misplaced abstraction. That is to say, the identification of an abstract logic at the level of a theory of value is then treated, projected onto the workings and the development of capitalism itself. So as though with the real subsumption of ever more domains of social and human life by the capital relation, capitalism, actually existing capitalism, would increasingly approximate a logic of value which is indeed indifferent to particularities. I think this is a fallacy of misplaced abstraction in line with a number of critics and a number of arguments, I think possibly best synthesized in David Roediger's recent collection, Class, Race, and Marxism, where he draws on, amongst others, Lisa Lowe, Dipesh Chakrabarty, Michael Leibovitz, and others. The contention there against what I call this fallacy of misplaced abstraction is that the production of racial and other differences is itself part of the logic of capital. So I think that, to me, is a starting point in a way for any productive discussion of this nexus of real abstraction and racial capitalism. As long as we treat abstraction as something which is intrinsic to the logic of capital, but not to that of race and other oppressions, I think we both misunderstand the historical reality of capitalism and, in a sense, strip ourselves of the theoretical tools to develop a kind of proper analysis of this. Now, I think it's interesting, even though I won't talk very much at all about Sohn-Rethel, it's interesting that a lot of these debates, and these debates have also played out in terms of the debate over post-colonial theory between Vivek Chibber and Partha Chatterjee, et cetera. A lot of these debates center around the question of abstract labor. Now, I say that's interesting because, of course, most critiques of Sohn-Rethel's account of real abstraction, including ones in our own journal and conference by the likes of Anselm Japp or Elena Louise Lang, have pointed to the fact that Sohn-Rethel's critique is, in a sense, a critique that is, as Sohn-Rethel himself, recognizes, in a sense, at an angle, at a diagonal angle from Marx's own accounts, in as much as the exchange abstraction, of course, is an abstraction that long predates the emergence of capitalism. Of course, it has to long predate it because, amongst other things, Sohn-Rethel wants to demonstrate how this practically existing abstraction is the condition of possibility for the very genesis and formation of philosophy as such in ancient Greece, let's say from Parmenides onwards. Here, there's a complicated debate that we could get into about the relationship between exchange abstraction and abstract labor, but I think it's important that this characteristic of indifference, which Wood herself turns to, is a characteristic that Marx himself ascribes to abstract labor in a way much more emphatically than to exchange. So, for instance, in the Grundrisse, Marx writes, "Since capital as such is indifferent to every particularity of its substance and exists not only as a totality of the same, but also as the abstraction from all its particularities, the labor which confronts it likewise subjectively has the same totality and abstraction in itself." Now, I think one of the objects of accounts of the nexus of race and capital and of race and class that have foregrounded the production of difference, a formulation from Lisa Lowe that David Roediger and Betsy Esch, especially in an article on racial management in HM, have advanced very forcefully. The onus, of course, of these accounts of the production of difference is to demonstrate that the category within the critique of political economy of abstract labor should not be understood in terms of the actual homogenization and de-differentiation of exploited labor itself. So I think in that regard, all of these positions see the practice of racialization, as well as, of course, the practice of the gendering of labor as imminent to the logic, and in fact, point out that the valorization of capital requires the constant production of differences. In this sense, also echoing arguments coming from geography, as in the work of Neil Smith on uneven development, or indeed to mention other arguments made in the pages of HM, Massimiliano Tomba's arguments about the differentials of surplus value. Now, added to this attention to the production of racial and other differences as itself part of the logic of capital, I think is the argument, the definition of racism itself as a practice of abstraction. So not just the articulation or nexus of abstract labor and racializing practices, but also racism more broadly, both in its material practice and in its discursive ones, as being a practice of abstraction. This is a formulation famously present in the work of Ruth Wilson Gilmore, who writes in an article from 2002, racism is a practice of abstraction, a death-dealing displacement of difference into hierarchies that organize relations within and between the planet's sovereign political territories. Racism, she continues, functions as a limiting force that pushes disproportionate costs of participating in an increasingly monetized and profit-driven world onto those who, due to the frictions of political distance, cannot reach the variable levers of power that might relieve them of those costs. Now, what I think is important here is also to note that in this account of racism as articulated with the violence of capitalist abstraction, racism is not something that's simply occurring at the level of the internal divisions of the working class, the element that's most emphasized, of course, in the work of Roediger. Racial capitalism in this regard is also occurring at the levels of eviction, expulsion, extraction, rent, and all sorts of practices of profit-making and valorization outside of the point of production. I think it's interesting that Gilmore herself, as well as Stuart Hall, writing on race, who she also draws on, often use this metaphor of the fix, a metaphor that, of course, in Gilmore's work also echoes the idea of a spatial fix in geography and in the work of David Harvey and the like. As Hall puts it, what racism does, it masks the complexes of feelings and attitudes, beliefs and conceptions that are always refusing to be stabilized and fixed. It's rigid because of its very complexity, is the argument. And here, interestingly enough, Hall also draws on a passage from Frantz Fanon in which he uses fixing in a slightly different metaphorical sense to say that the effect of race is to fix a subject in the sense in which, quote, a chemical solution is fixed by a dye. So there's both the sense of a spatial fix and also a sense of a rigidification, a reification of subjectivity itself. Now, what I wanted to do in my remaining, I guess, 5 to 10 minutes, having laid out very impressionistically arguments for or positions that refute this polarization of abstraction on the side of capital and particularity or difference on the side of race, who try to think the logic of differentiation and racialization as imminent to capital itself. I wanted to just think of another element, which is, of course, very significant both to the thinking of real abstraction and to the thinking of racial capitalism, which is that of, to use a formulation from Henri Lefebvre, the survivals, or the relationship between abstraction as an ongoing and real feature of capitalist social relations, and the survivals or legacies of previous historical formations and modes of production. Now, I think here it's very striking that around the time that Sohn-Rethel was formulating his position, that is to say, the late 1920s, early 1930s, Henri Lefebvre and his collaborator and comrade Norbert Gutermann write, actually in 1933 to 34, a book called La Conscience Mystifiée, Mystified Consciousness, which is then published in 36. And it's a book that lays out, in relation to their pioneering studies of alienation in the early Marx and in Hegel, a whole account of real abstraction, a term, incidentally, they actually use in the book itself. And it's uncanny, notwithstanding the massive stylistic and methodological differences, how much resonance and overlap there is with themes of in Sohn-Rethel, not least the account of the emergence of philosophy from the exchange abstraction, which is made explicitly by Lefebvre and Gutermann. There might have been connections, of course. Guterman was in the orbit or the margins of the Frankfurt School. Lefebvre himself wrote a review for the Journal of the Frankfurt School around 1937. And it was around 1936 that Adorno sent that famous letter to Sohn-Rethel saying that receiving his work was like Newton finding Leibniz and vice versa. So the moment is very interesting. It's also very interesting to think of that moment because this attempt to think the efficacy and the place of real abstraction in the critique of everyday life, again, a term that Lefebvre already uses in the 1930s, is of course driven by a confrontation with the reality of fascism. And in fact, of fascism as a way of fixing the disquiet, the turbulence, the tumult that the accumulation of historical abstractions, myths, ideologies, the nation, conceptions of race, both medieval and modern, etc., the way that this accumulation of abstraction interacts with the devastating effects of the real abstractions of financial capitalism, which is in a somewhat classical communist anti-fascist mode, the focus of Guterman and Lefebvre's account. And I think it's this formulation that they advance of thinking together abstraction and these survivals, these survivants, thinking in a sense the historicity and the accumulation and articulation of real abstractions themselves, which is one of the most interesting dimensions of their work. As they write in La Conscience Mystifiée, what is being experienced in 1934, very significant year also in French politics that they're writing, is, as they put it, a prodigious heaping up of abstractions, notion, myths. In effect, our current consciousness is made up of all the experiences and all the interpretations that have appeared in human history, piled up and tangled without order. Everything can be found here, and not as moments in a totality, but as isolated elements in conflict with the rest of our consciousness. And here I think the key element for them is to think the nexus or the articulation between, on the one hand, these accumulated, this is a term they use, which is quite striking, accumulated abstractions. So this kind of geological sedimentation of indeed, as the nightmares, weighing on the brains of the living, so to speak, and the contemporary forms of abstraction that they identify with finance capital. And here it's very interesting too that the reality or the real abstraction of finance capital is for them treated in two keys or in two valences. On the one hand, it is something that has an unreal reality, that is spectral and so on, but it is also real in the sense that it is made possible and conditioned by formidable spatial and material apparatuses. So this is what they write, again, 1934. Finance capital, they quote, they say, never manages to become independent and to separate itself from the capitalist and from production. Abstraction, yes, but one which presupposes an immense material system and apparatus. An abstraction that cannot displace itself above and beyond the rest of the world, opposed as concrete, but which intervenes and modifies and concretizes itself in acts. Social relations have been seized by the strange mythology of capital. Capital sweeps men away in this frightening machinery. It is a phantom with limbs of steel, which I think is a very nice sort of metaphorical extension of Marx's account. It is at once abstract and terribly concrete. And I think this point of thinking together the accumulated abstractions, the survivals of the history of mystification, and the reality of financial capitalism makes this account, which is again contemporaneous with the first formulations of Sohn-Rethel's, a very fruitful one. It also resonates interestingly, including with this riff on the past weighing like a nightmare, with some of Stuart Hall's own work from the 1980s, trying to use Althusser's account of contradiction and overdetermination to think through race. Hall argues that there are different social contradictions with different origins. The contradictions which drive the historical process forward do not always appear in the same place and will not have the same historical effects, and sometimes have delayed effects, sometimes have uneven or non-synchronous ones. So to conclude, I think drawing on these various sources, and again, this is kind of like a sketch of resources to think through this very vexed question of the relationship between real abstraction and racial capitalism. I think a critique of real abstraction that has real political teeth, so to speak, needs to think of it as entangled with the production of differences, but must also be a practical critique of these survivals, that is to say, of the history of real abstraction and the history of the kind of geological stratification of all the myths, mystifications, and nightmares of the past. And as Lefebvre and Guterman, I think, argued presciently in the 1930s, this is necessarily also a critique of the fixes or the pseudo-resolutions of the real unreality of abstraction that are advanced by fascism and related mystifications. So thank you.
Thanks very much, Alberto. I think an extremely interesting and important contribution, which looks at the relationship between race and capital and abstraction, particularity and concretization. And this sort of theory, of course, is extraordinarily important at times now when Black Lives Matter and these forms of struggle are actually at the pinnacle of the politics we're currently experiencing. And now over to Conrad Hamilton.
Hello, HM 2020. I am incredibly excited to present for you today. And I just want to say, before I start that it's a tremendous honor here to present with Alberto and Katerina. These are people whose work was an inspiration to me long before I ever made it to HM, right? And thank you so much to Jazz and to Paul for helping organize this too and encouraging it. I appreciate it greatly. So I have a slideshow for you today, as much as anything else, because I thought, I was feeling a little bit nervous about this presentation. So I thought that it would be good for me to keep myself on track a little bit. So I'm just going to start the slideshow here. 1 second. Sorry. Okay, just give me a minute. I'm going to share the screen. There we go. And okay, there we go. So my presentation is called, with a touch of melodrama, I think, The Unfinished Revolution of Real Abstraction. And I am Conrad Hamilton from Paris 8 University, as I think Paul elaborated well earlier. So I started with a quote here, and that quote is from Sebastiano Timpanaro, his 1975 essay, Structuralism and Its Successors. It appears, therefore, that post-structuralism, with only a few partial exceptions, is destined for the time being to remain in that closed circle of various alternating forms of idealism, in which, for a number of decades now, sorry, 1 second, I just, pardon me. In which, for a number of decades now, Western culture has been revolving, and from which only a new socio-political situation can release it. So what I want to ask, first of all, is it possible that Marxist philosophy has, since the recession of 2007, 2008, begun to break out of the closed circle of idealism described by Timpanaro? The first thinkers, I think, who attempted to expand Marxist thought into a kind of full-blown philosophical system, like Engels and Lenin, they tended to focus in their systematization of Marxism on epistemic continuity, positing what's been described, sometimes a bit glibly, as an empiricistic reflection theory. But the search for the moment when things went wrong after the failure of the 1918 uprisings in Europe, as well as the rise of Stalin in the USSR, subsequently led to, at least in the West, a shift in which epistemic discontinuity came to be privileged, something heralded by the importance assigned to ideology, as well as to superstructural effects in the works of Lukács and Gramsci. So, the notion of ideology being used to explain these, ostensibly undesirable changes. But I think this terminated ultimately, this focus on kind of ideology, superstructure. I think one potentially negative consequence of this is that it ultimately terminated in a sort of post-structuralism that relinquished any notion of the outside in favor of a never-ending process of kind of internal signification, right? So I think that, you drift further and further from a kind of materialist theory. And you see this in the transition, right? Where someone like, Louis Althusser had been the mentor of people like Foucault and Derrida, who retreat even further from the sort of materialist ethos, right? But I think more recently, actually just since, with the change that Timpanaro describes, with the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, and I specify as important here the 2007 speculative realism workshop at Goldsmiths. I think what we've seen is a kind of third wave of Marxist epistemology, which has emerged. And what I'm going to call here the third wave of Marxist epistemology, I think takes its inspiration above all from Alfred Sohn-Rethel's seminal 1970 text, Intellectual and Manual Labor. I think the English translation was 78, if I'm not mistaken, and the related notion of real abstraction. Now, in Intellectual and Manual Labor, Sohn-Rethel argues that the formal structure of non-empirical abstraction, it's an interesting phrase he uses to describe this, derives from the commodity form, that it is, in other words, the real abstraction of commodity exchange and the related creation of a caste of individuals whose vocation is wholly intellectual, that bestows us with the perception of nature as a, quote, physical object world antithetically divided from the social world of man and from its history. It's thus for Sohn-Rethel, the commodity form manifested as money, which permits the foundation of philosophy as a discipline committed to uncovering the unitary essence which governs the world. Take Thales' view, for example, that all is water, or in what Sohn-Rethel takes as an even more developed expression of this drift, the Parmenidean conception of the one. And, abridging considerably Sohn-Rethel's historical account in Intellectual and Manual Labor, we'll just say that for Sohn-Rethel, the coup de grace of real abstraction are Kant's categories a priori, insofar as they codify the world in a manner consistent with the exchange abstraction. The primacy of what he calls strict causality, for example, for him owes to the abstraction of commodity exchange insofar as it brackets material change. So I think arguably the thinker most important to the mainlining of real abstraction after 2007 is Alberto Toscano. And with respect to the speculative realist conference I mentioned, which also heralded a sort of ontological materialist shift in philosophy, it's interesting to note that he was a moderator and co-organizer of that conference as well. But Toscano's essays from the late 2000s onward, I think, find him really waging a kind of two-pronged battle. On one side against sun-dry ontological materialisms, as well as against residually rationalist Marxist epistemologies. So you had this trend, of course, right, that went hand in hand, and even presaged, we could say, the speculative realism conference to people taking great interest. Of course, you have Bruno Latour and Graham Harman, actor network theory, object-oriented ontology. There was a great interest in Whitehead in this period. So those are the sort of sun-dry ontological materialisms that I described. But also, I think we see Toscano criticizing, this tendency for Marxist epistemology to function rationalistically, as opposed to trying to grasp the relationship of thought to capitalism. And an example of that might be, for example, Louis Althusser. While Toscano's writings on the subject are exemplary, I might question here whether his commitment to what he calls in the essay Against Speculation, weak Kantian correlationism, a stance that is necessitated for him due to the de facto hegemony of real abstraction, doesn't risk occluding the possibility in some ways of escaping our dispensation. So again, I stress that it's not that Toscano is just simply a Kantian or something like that. But what he argues is that we have to remain within a sort of weak Kantian frame because that is the sort of epistemological horizon that's been issued as a consequence of our sort of capitalist dispensation, real abstraction, and so forth. And this issue surfaces variously throughout his work. In a 2010 commentary, Antiphysis, Antipraxis, on, among other things, Jason Moore, for instance, Toscano borrows from Sartre's Critique of Dialectical Reason to argue that matter, what he calls matter, these sort of conceptions of nature, function as an inversion or petrified backlash of our praxis. But I think, you have Jason Moore, who argues that the division of the world into society and nature is structurally homologous with the commodity form. One of the interesting things about Moore's conception of relative exhaustion, right, the way that there are these periodic ecological collapses which occur, is that he identifies our current one as actually giving us the ability to access what he describes as the real relational movements of nature as a whole. So to deliver us from this entire ideological bifurcation. And so I think that by putting, by sort of trying to codify the schema with respect to the notion of the inversion of praxis, Toscano risks reprising a kind of correlationist schema and maybe occluding that vector of escape. Another thinker who's worked really interestingly with the concept of real abstraction is Katerina Kolozova. And I'm going to try to offer a sort of schematic summary of her work. It's very rich and dense, so it can be difficult. But for Kolozova, the mandate of philosophy to totalize reality is sort of structured in accordance with the exchange abstraction. And against this, Kolozova, whose work owes much to Francois Laruelle, insists upon the need for non-philosophy, which of course, as she said, is not like anti, it's like non-Euclidean geometry, not to appeal to a naive plane of physical reality as its operative basis, as with vulgar materialism, but to grasp via the void of the real, its eminence to sensuous conditions exogenous to itself. So in this, I would stress it's not about reducing, trying to explain everything, all thought, for instance, with respect to or in relation to sort of an abstracted plane of materiality, but it's about trying to understand or resist the temptation to do philosophy in a way that attempts to circumscribe reality in relation to it. Kolozova's Laruelle-influenced opposition to dialectics, however, means she conceptualizes revolutionary upheaval atemporally as a kind of ecstasis or stepping beyond. So for Kolozova, she writes, the contradiction taken in extremis must be resolved by self-dissolving the impossible, unsustainable. If it exacerbates the fissure with the real and the physical that it is introduced in principio, it will founder as the real starts to act on its own, escaping the control of philosophy, which is the ideology of capitalism. So I want to ask then, I want to say, we're in this situation, real abstraction, the epistemology of the exchange abstraction defines our society. I want to pose the question of, is there a way that we could possibly escape this? And not just a way, but especially I want to think of sort of dialectical or temporal way to get out of it. Now, Sohn-Rethel himself, in Intellectual and Manual Labor, he sees the overcoming of real abstraction as potentially being brought forth due to a restoration or reprisal of what he calls the labor synthesis, in which nature is no longer seen as divorced from manual practice. So for Sohn-Rethel, you have the labor synthesis presages the rise of the appropriation synthesis, and that's a society in which you're not in a situation in which the labor of individuals is being appropriated by sort of higher ups. But what Sohn-Rethel also sees with the establishment of communism is the possibility to return to or to reprise something like the labor synthesis. However, this vector of escape is problematized, or this notion has been problematized by Moïse Poston. And Moïse Poston's famous critique of Sohn-Rethel is that what Sohn-Rethel looks to labor, right, the category of labor, to find, a means of getting beyond what he calls non-empirical abstraction or real abstraction. But Poston's critique is that the category of labor itself, as we understand it, is only a consequence of the structuration of production by what he calls the commodity form of social relations or capitalism. But I want to say that I think, so even if we accept this critique by Poston, right, that we can't simply look to this notion of labor, that this is naive because labor is summoned into existence, by capitalism. There are moments in intellectual and manual labor where Sohn-Rethel signals in a different direction. His claim, for instance, that there are signs that our 20th century science, which has achieved the enormous advance to atomic and nuclear physics, has left bourgeois science behind and has assumed a state where it no longer fits the rationality on which capitalism relies for its continuance. So this is a really interesting passage, right? Because what we see here is Sohn-Rethel implying that there are processes of abstraction that are sort of set on, by the commodity form, by capitalism, that sort of escape its own grip, right? So this would suggest that the pathway beyond real abstraction may actually lie in the intensification of abstraction rather than merely the excision of it. I think it's interesting because if classical physics has been sort of superseded by Newtonian physics, it's also interesting to note that the equation between labor and a Newtonian body that only moves when acted upon, made by Adam Smith, is kind of destabilized by the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, in which you have a huge sort of rift that's opened up between value and price as a consequence of the rise in the organic composition of capital. And I also want to say that, science, right, in Sohn-Rethel's formulation, emerges sort of, he talks about the physical object world of nature, emerges as a consequence of kind of the structuration of epistemology or by the exchange abstraction. Developments in science, such as fields such as those of thermodynamics and ecology, have also helped shed light on the way that nature is not simply a kind of substantial externality that can be freely pilfered from. So this is very interesting, right? Because, again, science set on by capital, right, to strengthen its ability to sort of freely appropriate use values. But what science, often it doesn't bring back the right message, right? What it shows us is that, in fact, our sort of, ecological landscape is far more precarious and sensitive to these forms of appropriation than we might have imagined, or that would be congenial to sort of the metaphysics of capital. And lastly, I'll say that likewise, where the category of labor has been increasingly, I think, and I speak specifically of the West here, has been increasingly abstracted out of existence, we should remember Jameson's dictum that Marx's Capital is firstly a book about unemployment, and that the reserve army of labor can function as a potent vector of resistance in the battle for the liberation of free time, such as with, for example, Guy Standing's notion of the precariat. And there we go, I'm done.
Okay, thanks very much, Conrad. Really, really sophisticated paper. And I think the way you bring Katerina and Alberto together is very interesting. And it's quite clear that two things should be said about this. One is that it's generating an awful lot of questions, and I'm sorry if we're not going to get through all of them. And the other is that these are papers, I think, which can be appreciated again and again. And certainly I'll be listening to this presentation, this whole session again, when it's on YouTube at the same link as people are watching now. So I'm not going to be able to do justice to all the questions, but I'll start with three. First, there's a question: can you say more, Katerina, about how your theory of oppression emerges from the critique of idealism Marxism? Alberto, from Chris Nelson, this one: why turn to Lefebvre instead of, say, Cedric Robinson for this theory of prehistories of capitalist racialization? And then from China Meville, and this is a bit for Alberto, I suspect also a bit for Conrad, but actually a bit for everyone. What, if anything, is specific about historical abstractions as opposed to mystifications? Who would like to take that first? Okay, Katerina.
Unmute myself. I guess I can go first. So I would not say that what I presented was a theory of oppression. It was more of a proposal how to think of oppression and how to come up with conceptual means and possibly strategic solutions as to how to address oppression as such in all of its forms, beyond the logic of not just identity politics. I don't have an issue with identity politics, not in the sense it is habitually problematized or discussed. I have this epistemological problem with subjectivity-centered thought or episteme of whatever form of Marxism we might engage in, or socialist theory we might engage in. So the proposal here is a complex one. It is a proposal to move away from the episteme that is subjectivity-centered, that engenders identity politics as a true result of this fallacy of reification, as any classical Marxian would identify it. So move away from this form of thought whereby subjectivity legislates all thought, and thereby arrive at means that would enable us to discuss the problems, to problematize oppression, to analyze, dissect forms of oppression, and come up with political programs in a manner that is systemic, structural, and not subjectivity-centered. Not centered on the individual, not centered on the individual perspective or experience. Not that that it's not relevant, and that it cannot be, I don't know, a conceptual ground or you know, a topic that we can, you know, even an individual, a compilation of individual experiences can create a topic in and of itself. But then we move away from the perspective of the individual account and try to establish this epistemology I talked about at the beginning of the third party perspective. Now, I think I can talk more about that, but that will take too much time. I hope this is clear. If it's not, I can add some more after Alberto responds to the question and Conrad to his question.
Okay, Conrad, would you like to come in?
Sure. Oh, yeah, can you hear me? Okay.
Yes, come in now.
Come in? What do you mean?
Do you want to respond to the questions?
Yeah, I can respond. Yeah. Okay, so I can just pick a question and respond, I guess.
Perhaps respond to the questions I asked.
Okay. Did I miss something? You have a sorry.
Move the bar downwards, Conrad.
Okay, no, I got it. Okay, I see. I got it. Okay, sorry. So I have one here for Conrad from Chris Nielsen. My question for you would be, why think of accelerating capitalist accumulation as intensifying abstraction rather than as a struggle over the rate of profit? Well, I mean, when we were discussing this issue earlier, I think one of the really interesting things about what I characterize as this sort of third wave of, material epistemology is that I think that in some ways it does represent a kind of, synthesis in the dialectical sense of the earlier two tendencies, right? So I think that, obviously you have a very, again, quite empiricistic, if we're talking about certain conceptions of reflection theory, I think with, a lot of later developments, we have this focus on ideology and superstructure. And I think one thing about real abstraction as a kind of theoretical program is that you have a kind of materialism which is articulated, but it's articulated indirectly, right? Because it's not necessarily articulated, directly in relation to physical things that exist, but in terms of the structuration of social or material reality by the commodity form. So I think that, if we're looking at this question, right, which is why not simply discuss the rate of profit, what I'm interested in is the way that, the consequences of the struggle, these abstractions, they're not simply visible on, just the kind of economic terrain. They also manifest, philosophically and metaphysically. So it's like I was saying, right? I think that, and it's very, very significant to Sohn-Rethel, and this has been elaborated a great deal by Jason Moore, right? This notion that you have a kind of abstract conception of nature that emerges because of decision between use value and exchange value, to simplify. So, for Moore, in a certain sense, and he talks about this as being what he calls the Cartesian divide, this gives tremendous license, right, to the what he calls use value appropriations, which are engaged in by capital. So, of course, we can examine that, materially, and I think it's very, very valuable to do that. But I also think, and it would be interesting to discuss, sort of the popularity of these sort of monistic ontologies today, right, that purport to dissolve this divide. I think it's very, very interesting to look at the way that, and again, speculative realism, very profitable to analyze in this light, the way that there are actually changes, right, to the way that we conceive metaphysics that correspond with these developments, which are economic and scientific, right? So I wouldn't want to confine myself just to, I think it's hugely important, but I wouldn't want to confine myself just to looking at the economic side. I think it's also very, very important to look at kind of the conceptual correspondence which exists as well.
Okay, thanks, Conrad. Alberto, you might want to add to that, or perhaps to go back to the questions, and the two particular questions I think might be relevant to you, which is Chris Nelson's why turn to Lefebvre instead of Cedric Robinson, and then the question around what, if anything, is specific about historical abstractions as opposed to mystifications.
Yeah, thanks for those questions, Chris and China. And then there's also a question from Tom Bunyard about critique of fascism. I may just fold in there whilst I'm at it. So obviously I alluded in the very title of the talk to the work of Cedric Robinson, though I suppose I would want to argue that the accounts of racial capitalism, or at least the accounts of the nexus of race and capital that I explored at the beginning in terms of the production of difference, don't require, and in some cases might also significantly depart from, the very specific theory of racial capitalism outlined by Robinson in Black Marxism. And I say that in part because Robinson's account, well, first of all, is not particularly, and this was also the reason for turning not just to Lefebvre and Guterman, but also to Stuart Hall. Robinson's account is not particularly concerned also in its critiques of Marxism with questions of abstraction, theories of value, abstract labor, and the like. In fact, when in an essay that is now in the collection of essays on racial capitalism by Robinson, which I think is called white signs or something along those lines. He explicitly criticizes that formulation about indifference from Ellen Wood that I'd quoted. But when he criticizes it specifically in terms of the way that it elides what he actually calls race consciousness. And the question of consciousness is central to Robinson. But I think in making that question of consciousness central, at least in Black Marxism itself, the dynamics of the racialization of capital's processes of abstraction is not really problematized. I think this is quite different in a work that, to my mind, is much more methodologically and analytically interesting on the nexus of race and capital from Robinson himself, which is his last book, Forgeries of Memory and Meaning, whose account of what he calls racial regimes is considerably closer to, in a sense, the contingent articulations between race and class and capital that I was trying to discuss by Hall and others. Obviously, this is a very complicated and long debate. There's an interesting piece on this question recently I saw by Charles Post on the Brooklyn Rail, and there's obviously a heady debate about to what extent the very formulation of racial capitalism is compatible with Marxist analysis or not. Certainly, it wasn't for Robinson himself, but for other people who have been employing it, like Robin Kelly or Walter Johnson in his excellent recent book on St. Louis, matters are a bit different. The question about abstraction mystification, I think, is very useful, perhaps, to distinguish between the proposals advanced by Sohn-Rethel and Guterman and Lefebvre more or less at the same time. Lefebvre and Guterman, and possibly Guterman via Lukács, though Lefebvre said he hadn't read him at the time, in a sense, emphasize this question of abstraction in terms of the question of quantification. Of course, this is a debate that Sohn-Rethel would have also, and others would have gotten from the likes of Zimmel and other non-Marxist figures as well. So the commodity fetish is important for this philosophical and ideological critique because it provides an account of the genesis of abstraction as a genesis of forms of homogenization and quantification that are intrinsic to the logic of capital. When Guterman and Lefebvre talk about mystification, mystification is not identical to abstraction. It is, in fact, in a sense, and that's why the title of the book is Mystified Consciousness. It is it is a question of in a sense, the subjective or the experiential correlate of those real abstractions. And mystification can be both very quotidian at the level of everyday life, but also philosophical, literary, and so on. So I think, so in one sense, an account of abstraction or an account of real abstraction is not for Guterman and Lefebvre sufficient for a practical, i.e. revolutionary critique of ideology, which needs to inquire into mystification and therefore also be a critique of everyday life. Now, if you, this is important if we contrast it to Sohn-Rethel, in as much as in Sohn-Rethel, he says the act of exchange abstraction is abstract and also social, you could say, and conscience or consciousness doesn't know anything about it. Now, that is the case also for Guterman and Lefebvre, but that not knowing, that social unconsciousness has effects on consciousness itself. And that's where the question of mystification comes in. And I guess this also, just to finish up, relates to the issue of the critique of fascism. The critique of fascism in Guterman and Lefebvre is specifically about the, in a sense, the intensification of these varieties of mystification that accompanies or weirdly correlates with the intensification in the processes of capitalism, specifically financial capitalist abstraction, right? And so, I mean, this is putting it extremely crudely, but it's as though there were a parallelism between the kind of implacable intensity of abstraction at the level of the financial domination over society, and on the other hand, the increasingly archaic, pseudo-archaic, pseudo-feudal forms of mystification that are at stake at the level of consciousness. And in this sense, there are very interesting, I think, resonances between the work of Lefebvre and Guterman on fascism and that of Ernst Bloch, written more or less again at the same time, especially at this, at the level of mystification. As they say, now there isn't just one opium of the people. There's a whole panoply available, from bourgeois literature to fascist, blood and soil ideology and the like.
Thanks, Alberto. There are two questions here which are to an extent directed at Katerina, but also to the whole panel. And I want to take those. One is from Tom Bunyard, and that's, can you please say a bit more about the idealist dimensions of Feuerbach? And the other from Mr. Asami, and that is, and I'll read it because it's beautiful. I have a question regarding decentralization addressing Katerina, but also the other dear panelists. And it's nice to have that sort of comradely touch. Aren't we looking at a metapsychology emergent from the Copernican revolution? How is this related to the unfinished Copernican revolution? Or Copernican revolution?
Oh, okay. I'm unmuted. Okay, the first question about the problem of idealism in Feuerbach. That gives me the chance to actually finish my first response. I realized that I missed addressing that part of the question. Why move away from subjectivity-centered thought? First of all, I said that would enable us to conceive completely different forms, structural, systemic forms, collectivist discourse, etc., of oppression. The intersections would not be reductivist or would not invite us to reduce the problem to one central identity issue, but in fact enable us to establish a grid of intersecting forms of oppression and address them in such manner. Subjectivity-centered thought that invites basically identity politics and kind of prevents us from engaging into what I just proposed. The problem with it is, first of all, the problem is that we cannot address the problem as to me, that is the problem, that it disables this proposal I just made. So the problem is political. Second of all, the problem is epistemological in the following sense. As long as thinking, contemplation, philosophy remains subjectivity-centered, it is inevitably idealist. And this is Marx's argument. This is his position in his critique on of Feuerbach, and and Feuerbach is also indirectly addressed in his critique of Hegel, of Hegel's philosophy in general, as he puts it. So a subjectivity-centered thought implies philosophy, a form of thought that is philosophy, which Marx has a problem with, and he has a problem with it because he believes that inevitably, inescapably implies idealism. So as long as we remain within philosophy, we remain within idealism. And regardless of how much we try to turn it upside down, as in the case of Feuerbach, we would still end up being idealists. And that is so because we remain in the form of philosophy. And we remain in the form of philosophy because we cannot move away from the form of thought that is legislated by the principle, by the legislating principle of subjectivity, so subjectivity-centered thought. And last but not least, Marx argues, I kind of expand this argument with the help of Laruelle, that a subjectivity-centered thought cannot be but a human subjectivity-centered thought. So we need both. We need proper post-structuralism, so post-structuralism that has moved away from the post-structuralist episteme and postmodernism. We need posthumanism. I meant posthumanism. Materialist posthumanism, which means moving away from subjectivity-centered thought, because this subjectivity-centered thought is always human subjectivity-centered thought. So we need, first of all, this excarnation of the subject as the legislating principle, and which leads us to Hegel's spirit, by the way, in order to realize that this is a mere abstraction, an abstraction among abstractions. It can be considered as a real abstraction, but a proper materialist treatment of any form of abstraction would be that is not subjectivity centered, that is the one of the third party's perspective, as Marx puts it. And by the way, this is his objectivism. So he's so he's not a positivist when he says he's an objectivist. He is an objectivist in this sense of the word. So the human is in fact not a privileged object. So it does not need to, or we should not permit it to become the legislative or organizing principle of thought, because we end up being self-centered, human-centered, and in that way we remain also idealists. And somebody asked me, it's related to this question, somebody asked me as well, where do I see this problem in Hegel? I discovered this problem in Hegel through Marx, actually. I'm assuming he refers to the phenomenology of spirit. Now, as for Hegel, his own work, it's been a while since I've read Hegel directly. Last time in 2009, I did a close reading of Hegel's logic. But I'm assuming Marx's critique is founded on his critique of Hegel's phenomenology and the notion of spirit as central in Hegel's philosophy. And this is how he sees it. And this is, I think this kind of illustrates how come philosophy always ends up being ideology. He says, Hegel's philosophy is about the abstract egoist, egoism raised in its pure abstraction. And further on in the same text, the critique of Hegel's philosophy in general, he says, the self-abstracted entity fixed for itself, so the spirit, is man as abstract egoist. Egoism raised in its pure abstraction to the level of thought, abstract thought. So here he discloses the core of his critique of the notion of spirit as central in Hegel. This abstracted, self-abstracted entity fixed for itself, this abstract egoist, is in fact man. So we have to do both, basically move away from anthropocentrism, move away from philosophy in order to establish the proper materialist episteme of our social reality, which of course covers both physical reality, tangible reality, but also abstract reality, which does, yes, have certain material effects, but it is in and of itself also real, such as I said, social relations, labor, for example, use value, as opposed to surplus value. Surplus value would be this self-sufficient, purely idealist, analogous to the philosophical notion of pure transcendence, etc. Hence, the possible comparison between capitalism and philosophy as such. Whereas use value, or use, the act of use, is at the same time material and abstract. So yeah, so here is this friction between materialism and idealism, and why it's relevant for different philosophy or theory, political theory, and possibly a political program of emancipation and understanding of oppression. So I think I covered both questions. Okay, I'll leave the floor to Alberto and Conrad now.
Okay, time is passing, so I'm basically going to ask one more question for all three people to respond to, and then we'll have to call it a day. And the question is from Tilhan, and this is the question. Can you please elaborate the nexus between the idea of accumulating abstractions and the SR concept of real abstraction, Sohn-Rethel concept of real abstraction? Are all accumulated abstractions real abstractions? If yes, by which practice? If not, what other abstractions are we dealing with? Alberto, could you go for that one first, please?
Sure. So, I mean, in terms of that formulation, it's not even really a concept, but maybe I've tried to turn it into one, of Guterman and Lefebvre on accumulating abstractions. That's a very ecumenical, promiscuous, whatever the term you want to use, conception of abstraction, right? It includes, yes, the exchange abstraction, but also abstractions linked to capital and also to politics and also to law that emerge long after that genetic moment of the emergence of philosophy that Sohn-Rethel was so concerned with, at least in the initial chapters of intellectual and manual labor. And I think here, one of the things that is difficult to tease out in this discussion is, on the one hand, what gives the strength of Sohn-Rethel's account of real abstraction is the fact that it functions as a kind of practical and social unconscious, right? So the, as he puts it, the act is social, the minds are private. The minds, in fact, don't know, what is happening is happening behind their backs, or the form of their act is not what the consciences or minds or consciousnesses are reflecting upon, right? However, it's impossible to understand the actual variable deployment, emergence of capitalism itself, and indeed deployment of various forms or varieties of capital, without understanding all sorts of explicitly deliberate and conscious practices of abstraction and of valorization that might be, built on this, now almost immemorial practices of exchange abstraction, but are in no sense straightforwardly unconscious. I mean, you have to think of like the formidable apparatus of juridical abstraction that makes, the most elementary act of exchange or valorization possible, the forms of abstraction linked to political apparatuses and so on. So I think this is where I think a critique of real abstraction has to include that dimension of social unconsciousness that was vital for Sohn-Rethel, but also incorporate a thinking of the plurality of social practices of abstraction, some of them very much deliberate, including, especially perhaps the juridical ones, and many of them also survivals from previous moments that get recombined and refunctioned in different ways, right? And I think that's one of the things that I like about that metaphor in Guterman and Lefebvre. Any science of or critique of ideology needs to also think in some sense geologically, right? These abstractions have sedimented and have been displaced and are reused. And so there isn't just one homogeneous field in which the automatic subject of capital, deploys its logic of homogenization. It's a far more, in a sense, it's a far more conflicted and a far more contingent terrain.
Thanks very much, Alberto. I'm going to ask Conrad to finish. So, Katerina, do you want to come in with any comment before Conrad comes in? No, you're fine. Conrad.
Hi. Yeah, so I don't have much to say to that question, but maybe we can go back to the last one that was posed to everyone about decentralization and the sort of unfinished Copernican revolution. Certainly when I think of the notion of an unfinished Copernican revolution, what springs to mind for me, of course, are the comments of Quentin Meillassoux in the Après la Finitude, when he talks about the discrepancy between the sort of mapping that Copernicus attempted to achieve and what Kant characterizes as his Copernican revolution in philosophy, which to a large degree involves, though of course the finer points of this are disputed, assimilating the external world to the perception of the subject. Again, to be quite schematic. I think it's interesting because one of the things I argue in my thesis work, for example, is that, if you look at what happened with these, because my argument here in the paper I presented here, my argument is that, just as capitalism itself has been destabilizing, the idealism that permeated philosophical discourse, right, and really achieved hegemony with post-structuralism, was also becoming or weakening considerably. And so I think since around the time of the Great Recession, 2007, 2008, that's been challenged. And I cited speculative realism as important to that. But I think it's important to remember that the kind of materialism, right, that was pursued by speculative realism was not a materialism in the Marxist sense. It was like more often than not, right? It was like an ontological kind of materialism. And I think the real problem here is so we're talking about metapsychology, decentralization. I think the real problem here is that this issue was never taken up from a meaningfully Marxist standpoint. So somebody like, Graham Harman, for example, following Bruno Latour, sort of weird reading of Heidegger, he will propose that we, understand the world in this sort of vitalistic vein, again, without getting into details. And this is, like, again, Latour, we have never been modern, let's go beyond these binaries of nature and society. But it's like, if we're talking about the anthropocentric privileging of the subject, this is also something that's part of capitalism, right? Because in capitalism, what do you need to produce value? You need human labor, right, to produce surplus value, right? That's something that's required. So, even Sohn-Rethel has pointed this out, for example. Often you have cases where we have the potential to fully automate a sector, right? But instead of fully automating that sector, what do? We ship jobs over to China because we need human labor, right? So I think if you look at kind of our, this meta-psychology, this humanist, this residual humanism that continues to infuse our philosophy and that seems very, very difficult to shed, I think a lot of it relates to this relationship, between humanity and the production of value, right, as surplus value. So I think if what you want to achieve is a kind of thinking beyond the human, right, which is what a lot of people who are interested in or align themselves with speculative realism, it's what they purport to want to achieve. I think that has to become a sort of economic and political critique. It can't remain at a purely abstract and philosophical level. And what a great time now to really inaugurate and go beyond some of the limitations of the philosophical changes that accompanied the Great Recession, because now, we're facing, this dramatic economic and sort of political catastrophe, and just as, maybe sort of the some of the political solutions that have been proposed in the past 10 years, the bailouts and so forth, were not radical enough. I think we have to say at this point that the philosophical materialisms that have dominated throughout the last decade have not been radical enough.
Okay, thanks very much indeed, Conrad. And thanks to Katerina Kolozova, Alberto Toscano, and Conrad Hamilton. If you have enjoyed, and I'm sure you have enjoyed, both the presentations and the constructive questions, then I'd encourage you to see discussion just like this in Historical Materialism Journal, and we have a subscription offer on at the moment. Thanks very much for listening. Tomorrow we have transgender Marxism in the afternoon, and in the evening, culture and realism. We hope you'll join us for those. But in the meantime, thanks very much.